we're in extraordinarily good luck today. My wife and I, Diane and I, have both been fans of Valerie Tarico for a very long time, read a lot of her stuff. I literally could go on about introducing her and what she has to offer for some time, but people like my wife have said, Ed, people don't want to hear you, they want to hear Valerie. Shut up. So Valerie Tarico, I'll tell you a little bit. She has a PhD, she has a blog. She was raised in evangelical fundamentalism. She's a psychologist in Seattle, prolific writer, author of Trusting Doubt, a former evangelical looks at old beliefs in a new light. And every subject I've ever seen her write on, she brings some new insight to, even when it's subjects that I've read a lot about before, and that happens pretty often. She is a terrific writer, and I would strongly recommend you look at her free inquiry article from some years back on a somewhat similar subject. And I am really looking forward to hearing from Terrific Tarico. Valerie, take it away, please. And everybody mute yourself. I'm going to do that now.
Thank you, Ed. That may be a challenge to live up to, but I'll give it my best shot. So Ed and your leadership asked me to talk to you today about abortion. That is a top of mind kind of issue in our political context today. And also because of that, many people find themselves thinking about it in relation to their personal lives, whether it is their own reproductive history and kind of history of bringing children into the world, either under adverse circumstances or kind of out of a surprise pregnancy, or whether, or with intention and a forethought, or whether it's thinking about the young people in our lives. So even though I suspect that most of the people on this call are done with their own reproductive decision making, I think it's really important that we use the power we have and the voice we have to shape the conversations around us in ways that enable young people to form the families of their choosing, to live the lives of their choosing. And so what I want to do today is to talk about some different ideas and language related to abortion, that things that people, I think, often leave out of the abortion conversation. And the inspiration for this, or the invitation for this, came out of the article that Ed mentioned, which I titled "Why I'm Pro-Abortion, Not Just Pro-Choice," which was a radical thing to title an article at the time I did about 5 years ago. And then it became the most widely read article that I had published to date at that point. Let me explain that, because it doesn't mean I'm kind of championing that everyone have an abortion. What it means is that when we talk about abortion, the people who are opposed to abortion tend to use moral language. They think that it is morally wrong. People on the left, on the other hand, use pretty squishy language, or people kind of who are pro-abortion, pro-rights, pro-choice, pro-abortion access. And if you kind of back up for a minute, think about the moral spectrum. The moral spectrum kind of ranges from things that are, on the one end, forbidden morally, and then on to the other end, things that are morally obligatory. So a very simple illustration would be, can think about a 2-year-old in a river. If a 2-year-old falls into a river, it is morally obligatory, not morally discretionary or optional or a choice, whether you try to, from a moral standpoint, whether or not you try to rescue them. And on the other hand, it is morally forbidden to push a 2-year-old into a river, right? So there's that whole spectrum. And in the middle are things that are morally ambiguous, or where people feel like they have a choice about it. Well, the right, or people, kind of the religious right is who I'm talking about, people who oppose abortion, are using moral language in their opposition to abortion access. They talk about it being murder. They talk about it being kind of a sin. They talk about people having done something deeply terrible, women having done something deeply terrible that they now need to regret. In fact, some churches actually host these groups with new converts to evangelical fundamentalism, for example, who have had abortions, they try to not only elicit guilt, but deepen that guilt, saying, yes, you murdered your child, but then you'll get to see them in heaven. So they do this combination, this 1-2 thing, which is kind of true of Christian fundamentalism more broadly, where they induce guilt or a sense of inadequacy and then offer the solution to that. So they do the same thing with sin more broadly, and they kind of use similar language around people's reproductive decisions. So on the other hand, if you look at the language that is used by people who support right to abortion access and reproductive freedom more broadly, we tend to use fairly squishy language. We tend to say we're pro-choice. We believe in options, or some even say abortion should be, kind of safe and available but rare, or whatever it is. So we convey this ambivalence, we convey some sense of misgiving. Part of that is because abortion can be very morally complicated, and part of that is because because I think on the pro-choice end of the spectrum, people are very afraid of falling into what they think of as coercion or judgment. Don't want to be saying, you just got pregnant under really bad circumstances, you should have an abortion, or you must have an abortion. So we don't want to kind of create that sense of moral mandate around when we're looking at other people's lives and choices. On the other hand, and this is the part then that we end up missing out on, people often internally feel like it is a moral choice for them. It is very profoundly tied to their moral and spiritual values, so that people who are choosing to end an ill-begotten pregnancy, a mistimed or unwanted pregnancy, or one that is unhealthy, often feel like it would feel a violation of their values, or it would feel immoral for them to carry forward that pregnancy. And so what the problem with kind of some of the things being left out of our conversation is we don't then use the language that creates space for that and acknowledges that deep sense of moral inquiry, thought, and sense of duty or obligation that people may feel as they kind of try to make choices that maximize the well-being of their children, or their own ability to kind of participate in society in the future, or the person with whom they have gotten pregnant, or kind of the broader web of life. And all of those kind of factors that people kind of carry from a moral standpoint can be factors in an abortion decision. So what I want to do, so when I wrote the article, Why I'm Pro-Abortion, Not Just Pro-Choice, what I was trying to do is to model some of the language that suggests that we can take a morally affirmative stance. We don't have to be squishy. We don't have to say, yes, people should have a choice about abortion. We can take a morally affirmative stance to abortion access. But I want to say, before I kind of get into the details of that I would also describe myself as pro-choice. I'm pro-choice in that I think that people should, as individuals, be able to decide when and whether to kind of create a family and with whom, and that that these decisions are too important for government or for religious authorities or for any outsiders, medical authorities, to make the decision for us, that each person needs to be able to make those decisions on their own. And I mean, even though I think many abortion decisions get made in community, in a partnership with two people, one who provided DNA in the form of sperm and one who provided DNA in the form of an egg, making a mutual decision together, facing the future together, and that men can and should be involved in many of those abortion decisions. I also believe that ultimately the decision does need to default to the person most affected. The person who, when there's a disagreement, that it needs to default to the person who's pregnant. So I'm strongly pro-choice, but that said, I also am pro-abortion. And I say that I'm pro-abortion in the same way that I am pro-chemotherapy in response to kind of the presence of cancer in the world. I am pro kind of surgery in response to kind of the need for those surgeries. It's not that I think necessarily that those things are pleasant, they're aversive, they're expensive, invasive medical procedures, and abortion can be too, although it doesn't have to be. But that what we're talking about is that there are adverse circumstances that people face, and that in those circumstances, we need to give them access to the very best care that is available to them, that allows them to flourish, and not only the person who is kind of being affected directly by the medical care, but also the people who are around them. So if I kind of, now I want to just sort of step through some of what I've said, laid out as my reasons for being what I say is pro-abortion. I'm pro-abortion because being able to delay or to limit childbearing is fundamental to female empowerment and equality. Futurist Sarah Robinson said that if you look at all of the disruptive technologies of the 20th century, that the emergence of kind of reliable contraception is probably the most disruptive of them all, because without reliable contraception, women cannot fully participate in our democracy or our economy. So there's always a big contingency clause, which is simply unless or until I get pregnant, in which case all bets are off. And so the whole shift that we've seen in terms of women being able to kind of fully participate, as I said, in our political leadership and decision-making for our society at large, and in contributing fully to our economic well-being and prosperity and productivity and innovation, those things are all contingent on people being able to manage their fertility. I'm pro-abortion because well-timed pregnancies give children a healthier start in life. So we now have ample evidence that babies and children flourish best when women are able to space their pregnancies. When women experience rapid repeat pregnancies, there are impacts that affect not only their own health, but the long-term health of their children. And that what we know now is that the standard of care in prenatal care isn't simply get in there once you realize you're pregnant and get kind of those vitamins going and kind of manage diabetes and manage depression and all of the things that can negatively impact a pregnancy. But that, again, if you want the healthiest pregnancies possible, that we need to be talking about the preconception period, the time when a woman starts thinking about getting pregnant or is at risk of getting pregnant, but would roll with it. Those times are the best times possible for children, for healthy children, if we, in terms of, again, like thinking about what does it mean to get your diabetes under control? What does it mean to get your depression under control? What does it mean to kind of start kind of getting your body in the best possible shape, and to take the right kinds of vitamins and to kind of ingest the right kinds of nutrients to maximize the likelihood of a flourishing pregnancy. So that is independent of not only do well-timed pregnancies kind of physically allow people to prepare, but that what we know also is that there's all kinds of data that shows that children are much more likely to flourish when they come from wanted pregnancies, that they're more likely to get the kind of loving engagement, that they're less likely, there's kind of at the extreme end, to end up kind of with criminal behavior in young adulthood. There's all kinds of evidence that, in fact, when women are able, and when we trust women, and we trust women to, in concert with their partners, to make decisions about when to bring a child into the world, they simply do a better job of it than the God of nature does. I'm pro-abortion because I take parenthood seriously. Right. So most of us are able to push a baby out into the world. Most men are able to inseminate women, but parenting is a lot of work, and it takes 20 years of dedication, full-time focus, attention, patience, persistence, social support, mental health, kind of financial resources, and a whole lot more. It is life-changing. It's life-transforming. I think of I at one point when my daughters were young said, my children are both the worst and the best things in my lives. And my friend John said, "Oh, Valerie, you're so histrionic. You're so kind of extreme." And then he had children. And lo and behold, he found himself having exactly that same experience. And I just wrote an article about why we should stop trivializing men, why we should stop treating men as mere allies in the abortion fight. Because yes, women are most directly affected by unsought pregnancy and mistimed and unwanted pregnancy. But frankly, those 9 months of pregnancy are just a fairly small piece of this whole parenting equation. And young men, like young women, can have their lives and dreams and hopes and loves completely thrown off course by an unexpected pregnancy. And then, in fact, as I said before, when there is an unexpected pregnancy, the decision ultimately needs to default, I think, to the person most affected, the person who's pregnant. But not only do men then have less options once somebody becomes pregnant, but also they, by contrast with women, men's contraceptive options are crap, right? The best contraceptives available to young women now are state-of-the-art devices, IUDs and implants that have you get it in your body, it's get it and forget it. And they last anywhere from 3 to 20 years of not having to think about contraception at all. They have a failure rate of anywhere from about 1 in 700 to 1 in 2,000. Another way to say that would be that a person who has an IUD comfortably settled in their uterus is likely to experience a pregnancy 1 in every 700 years. By contrast, the best method available to men is almost a century old. You have to roll it on your penis every time you have sex, and it has a 1 in 10 annual failure rate. So over the course of like his reproductive lifespan, a man who was with his partners relying wholly on condoms might expect to experience 3 or 4 pregnancies, unsought, unwanted pregnancies. And so I think that we talk about men in ways that are not fair and that are disrespectful, in that if we want men to be the kinds of co-parents that young men mostly want to be, engaged with their children, being able to bring kids into the world when the time is right, not simply wanting to maximize the number of reproductive kind of offspring, and that they care about not being the kind of person that Warner is in terms of like producing and abandoning children and having to beg people to have abortions because they've been careless. If young men don't want to be that way, and yet we talk about them as if they were mere allies in the abortion kind of fight, or in the kind of what's at stake in terms of abortion access and contraceptive access. And that their whole job is to simply kind of line up behind women and support whatever women say about women's rights, which is helpful and which I appreciate. And I appreciate that many men care deeply about the well-being of the women in their lives and their mothers and sisters and daughters and partners. But men also are deeply affected with their own lives and hopes and dreams. And we, I think, should be having that conversation more. It's something that is absent on the right because they're not often supportive of abortion rights, or even the kind of development of contraceptive technologies. And it's absent on the left because people are so afraid of, there's such a narrative around, straight white men being at the top of pecking orders and having had it so good for so long, that we are then afraid to talk about kind of anything that might be perceived as empowering men more, or as recognizing the ways in which, in fact, the gender equation is reversed and men actually are less empowered or more vulnerable than women. We simply don't talk about those things. And as a consequence, I think we leave out this whole part of the abortion conversation, which is about the well-being of families and and what it means to actually be a parent, and what it means to be able to decide how to bring children into the world under the best circumstances available to you. I'm pro-abortion. So kind of, as I said, I think that like kind of, saying that, expecting that someone should carry forward a pregnancy because they misjudged, because they got drunk, because they were raped, whatever, it completely trivializes parenthood. And so it's ironic that you have these people who claim to so value parenthood and families and children, who are kind of then expecting kind of like that people should simply roll the dice on becoming a parent, or that kind of when circumstances bring in mistimed or unwanted pregnancy, they should simply carry it forward regardless of how much the odds are stacked against that person and their children flourishing. I'm pro-abortion because intentional childbearing, as I just said, kind of helps families to flourish. One of the ways that it helps families to flourish is that it helps people to get out of poverty. So there's research in a variety of countries, including everything from Bangladesh to the United States, that reproductive policy is economic policy. And that when you give people the means to decide when and whether to bring a child into the world, when you give them the means to time their pregnancies so that they can stack those circumstances in favor of their children flourishing, what you see is kind of people being able to kind of take a chance on getting a step ahead out of poverty, and that it takes the place over the course of kind of a couple of generations, that early unsought childbearing nukes opportunity, that kind of, when we talk about some of the disparities between, economic disparities in this country, again, one of the things that we often fail to talk about is that we have a much higher rate of surprise pregnancy, unplanned pregnancy in poor communities and communities of color, not all communities of color, but specifically Black and Hispanic communities. And so what you see then is that creates a kind of cascade of downstream effects in terms of people having a harder time getting out of poverty. So there's all kinds of other factors that we could talk about related to poverty, and systemic factors and individual bigotry and a bunch of things that kind of create adversity for people, and kind of the lack of intergenerational wealth that would allow people to kind of support the next generation better. But one of the key factors that we rarely talk about is this question of birth timing and circumstances, and whether kind of kids are coming into the world with the odds stacked in their favor or stacked against them. I'm pro-abortion because reproduction is a highly imperfect process. So, genetic recombination is a complicated progression with flaws and false starts at every step of the way. What we all know is that there's a lot more eggs and sperm produced than ever meat, and that there's a lot more fertilized embryos than ever kind of get implanted. There's a lot more fetuses than ever become healthy children, get born. And then there's, it was the history of our species that most children died in infancy or early in childhood. We have a high reproductive rate compared to some other mammals, because our reproductive rate and our ability to kind of bear children is optimized to compensate for this high rate of childhood mortality. So there's this systematic culling process that goes on during reproduction, in which faulty genetic recombination is much more likely to fail to kind of connect, fail to implant, fail to stay implanted in a woman's uterus, fail to be kind of to survive after birth. But the weeding out process itself is also highly imperfect, right? So sometimes perfectly viable combinations, healthy combinations, boot themselves out of a woman's body. She might be, sometimes horrible defects get through. A woman may be less likely to get pregnant or to carry a pregnancy forward if she is ill or starving or highly stressed. But we all know that women do carry pregnancies and give birth under those adverse circumstances. So even under devastating circumstances. So just like other medical procedures, therapeutic contraception and abortion basically complement what is a natural process in terms of it is, kind of being able to select for the best timing and circumstances so that human beings can survive and thrive and then go on to have offspring of their own. And basically what we're trying to do with pretty much all medical care is to complement medical processes that allow us to survive and thrive. Contraception and abortion are no different in that regard. Now, I'm also pro-abortion because I think that morality is about the lived experience of sentient beings. So I think that morality is about the experience of beings who can feel pleasure and pain, preferences and attentions, who at their most complex can be aware of their own existence and their own future and can prefer that and can live in relationship to other beings who love and are loved, and they value their own, as I said, value their own existence. So our moral obligations to any living being, whether human or otherwise, I think is predicated on what they are capable of experiencing and preferring. And what we know in that regard is that that a fertilized egg is capable of experiencing nothing, and that even after that cluster of cells begins pulsing, the proto-cardiac cells begin pulsing, and kind of the kind of religious right insists that that's a heartbeat and that it's now a person in some religious sense, that what we know is that that entity is not capable of experiencing anything, right? So when my daughters were growing up, we talked about this sort of concept of morality being a responsibility to lived sentient beings, and that our sense of responsibility to them is based on what they are capable of experiencing. It came up in the context in our family of our daughters wanting chickens when they were little, and they begged for years for chickens, and we told them, no, you don't get to have chickens. And then finally we said yes. And so they came home with chicks. And we said, okay, now you need to make a decision about your chickens. And you're going to have to decide whether they live in a coop or whether they get the free range of the yard. And then we talked about, here's how I make a decision about a non-human animal. I try to think about what they are capable of experiencing and caring about. And we talked about the fact that a chicken cares whether their beak is cut off, because that is their primary sensory modality. We talked about the fact that they care about being with other chickens because they are hardwired to be flock animals. We talked about that fact that they are capable of suffering cold, too much cold or heat or pain or hunger, that they probably don't care about their own longevity because they're not capable of conceptualizing that they may miss another chicken if it dies or disappears unexpectedly, but they probably don't miss it for too long as they are with other flock mates. And so in that context, our daughters, even at age, 8 and 10, were able to grasp these ideas. And then they made the decisions to let their chickens go free in the yard, even though they might live shorter lives, which in fact they did. And that has kind of become a guiding principle for them in a whole array of moral decisions, including the fact that both of my daughters now eat plant-based diets because of the complexities around trying to produce animal-based foods and kind of the suffering that goes into much of that. So when we think about decisions related to abortion and contraception, what we have going on with the religious right and the Catholic Church specifically is they are talking about things like ensoulment and, kind of man becoming a living soul. They're talking about, these kind of religious ideas that differentiate human beings from our kind of planetary co-travelers, that kind of somehow put us in a different category that actually diminishes the lived experience of other kind of sentient beings often, and then kind of makes human DNA uniquely valuable regardless of whether there is any sentience there remaining either at the beginning of life or at the end of life too. We could talk about this being kind of a parallel issue. So when I think about then abortion through a moral lens, kind of this idea of the platinum rule, do unto others as they would want you to do unto them. I think then what that means is that rather than thinking about this non-sentient kind of fetus, even at a point where it may kind of begin to look humanoid, that what we're talking about is the lived experience and the well-being of a whole bunch of people. First and foremost, of course, the person who is carrying that fetus, but secondarily, all of the people whose lives are entangled with her and the lives of people who love her, and then how that ripples out to even a broader community and society at large. I'm pro-abortion because contraceptives are imperfect and people are too. when I said that 1 in 10 couples relying on condoms will experience a pregnancy in any given year, we know that the advertisements for condoms advertise that they are significantly more reliable than that, right? It's more in the mid 90s. And yet those are kind of perfect use statistics, which is kind of hogwash because they're not being used by perfect humans, right? They're being used by imperfect humans. And so not only are contraceptives themselves imperfect, every contraceptive has some degree of failure, much higher for condoms, and the rhythm method even worse, than it is for pills, which are again much higher kind of pregnancy rate than it would be for a long-acting IUD or implant. But the contraceptives are imperfect, but people are imperfect too. And so, for that is the state-of-the-art contraceptives radically change these equations, but we need to recognize that even people under the best of circumstances have some risk of a mistimed or unwanted pregnancy, and that under the worst of circumstances, when people's lives are already chaotic or kind of when they're mentally ill, when they're particularly young, when we're talking about teenagers who have just become fertile, when we're talking about people who are living in poverty, whose lives are often more chaotic and stressful, that all of those things make it even more likely that a person will have a hard time using something like the condoms or the pill consistently and effectively. And then they're more likely to experience an unsought pregnancy. And then if they kind of have one of those, then kind of the cascade of stress can kind of sweep over them, and it's more likely that they'll have a second one, right? So some significant percent of teen pregnancies, for example, are second teen pregnancies. So what we need to do is to recognize this imperfection in human beings and in people. And in part, until, part of this will change when men have access to truly reliable contraceptives. But as I've written, and as the Male Contraceptive Initiative kind of talks about, this is going to take kind of years of research. There's some research underway, but nothing that would produce something as reliable as an IUD or implant. Maybe something that will get to the point that it's as good as the pill. It's complicated. And when you look at the cost of developing a new medication, and in this case specifically contraceptive medication, you're talking about somebody investing $500 million. And to date, the drug companies that produce contraceptives have found it more profitable to continue tweaking old formulations and to continue kind of advertise. They putting that money into advertising and kind of selling contraceptives that are available for women rather than basic research on contraceptive technologies for men. But I think that ultimately that's where we're going to have to get to, is if we want a norm of intentional parenthood, we need both each person to be able to manage their own fertility. It's not a question of whether women can trust men to kind of provide contraception, although many women do trust men in the form of condoms, right, to provide contraception. And it's not a question of whether men should be able to trust women. It's a question of each person. This is so important to all of us, that it's a question of each person being able to manage their own fertility, to own their own body, and be able to decide when and whether to kind of bring a baby into the world, so that babies get created by the mutual consent of two people, whether that's two partners in a couple, whether it's a woman and a sperm donor, whether it's a man and kind of with a surrogate and an egg donor, right? I mean, like, there's lots of ways consent can happen, but the idea is that each person has reliable means to own their own fertility. But in the kind of for the time being, that isn't the case. And so we have this vulnerability for both men and women that we need to figure out how to deal with. And so I'd personally love for the need for abortion to go away. I've written about that. As strongly pro-choice and pro-abortion as I am, I would love to see abortion becoming obsolete. And quite frankly, we can get most of the way there with the contraceptive technologies that we have for women. If we can kind of make state-of-the-art contraceptives easily available and readily available to all women who want them. Right now, most unintended pregnancy could be eliminated if women in this country and around the world had access to modern contraceptive technologies. But there is still a chunk of it that's going to also depend on men being able to have kind of access to contraceptive technologies of their own. So being pro-choice or being pro-abortion, sometimes people feel like they can't talk about wanting to prevent abortions, but quite frankly, we could reduce the unmet need for abortion by reducing the need for abortion. And one of the ways that I ding the progressive left is that they refuse to talk about this. They refuse to talk about it because they're afraid that if we talk about reducing unmet need for abortion by reducing the need for abortion, that somehow that means you're anti-choice or anti-abortion, which I think is hooey. And even some people on the left refuse these days to talk about birth control or contraception. I've been horrified to kind of discover that even within the upper echelon of Planned Parenthood nationally, there has become this deep ambivalence in terms of talking about contraception, and especially state-of-the-art contraceptives that require medical intervention, because the kind of conversation about contraception has gotten tangled up with the kind of ugly history of reproductive coercion in the early part of the 20th century, meaning forced sterilizations, even though all state-of-the-art modern contraceptives are immediately reversible. So that kind of has created this tangled web in which kind of people who should actively be promoting the tools that create reproductive empowerment are instead mum about a bunch of it, and are then kind of centering their conversation on political antagonism around abortion when they could be kind of working instead to solve problems and gradually, systematically working towards that goal of making abortion care obsolete. Abortion, as I said, not medication abortion, but surgical abortion is an expensive, invasive medical procedure, much less expensive and invasive than having an unwanted child. But we can do better than that. Why mitigate harm when you can simply prevent it? So I'm pro-abortion. Lastly, I would kind of coming back to kind of what I think of as moral language. I'm pro-abortion because I believe in mercy, grace, compassion, and the power of fresh starts. Right. So, many years ago, my friend Chip was driving down the freeway. His kid took off his seatbelt in the back seat. My friend Marla unbuckled her seatbelt to help their kid. Chip looked behind him, went off the road, flipped the car, and killed his wife. Right. All of us have made mistakes of that kind, or to that degree, and not had to suffer tragic consequences. Sometimes life gives us a fresh start and is forgiving and merciful, and sometimes it's not. And we have the power to kind of give each other the mercy of a fresh start in this case, right? And so I feel like, these words, mercy, compassion, forgiveness, the power of fresh starts, those sound like religious language, and they are religious language, but I am reclaiming them because those are concepts that don't belong just to religious people. They belong to all of us, and they are concepts that are deeply cherished, even when we're afraid of sounding too religious. And yet this is part of what I was talking about in terms of the moral spectrum, that we cede these very powerful, deeply meaningful concepts to the religious right, and then we don't use that language, and it makes us weak when we're advocating for what we truly believe is the best path in terms of people being able to flourish. So I would challenge you to think about kind of what it means to reclaiming some of the language that we feed to the religious right. I'm pro-abortion, because the future is always in motion, and I think that we have the power and responsibility to shape it well, to make kind of meaningful choices. So I think you all have probably read that story. Was it Asimov who wrote the story called The Butterfly Effect, or kind of who wrote a story about the butterfly and what became termed the butterfly effect, where kind of people time travel back to an ancient past, are told, be really careful, don't step off the path. and then they come back into the future only to find that a recent election is somehow different and these fascists have taken control, and they realize one of the people in their party stepped off the path and stepped on a butterfly and killed it, and somehow that killed butterfly changed the whole course of planetary history, right? So it's a kind of an intriguing sci-fi concept, but the fact is the future is always in motion. We are constantly making choices that shape the future. And again, the religious right tends to talk about, like missing children or missing babies. There are millions of missing babies, or they look at China and they talk about the missing girls. They don't talk about the surplus boys that were born when people had abortions and then got pregnant again because they wanted a son in China. They don't talk about all of the children that are born in the United States to people who were able to start over and wait again, right? So like I call my daughter, Bryn, my abortion baby, because when I got pregnant with my husband for the first time, we had decided it was time for us to have a child. And then I ended up catching a disease called toxoplasmosis during the first trimester, which is this disease that's transmitted by cats. It can cause in the first trimester the developing fetus to have brain lesions that when a baby's born can mean it is blind and deaf and has kind of cognitive malfunctions. And so we decided to abort that pregnancy and start again. And I felt grieved at the time of aborting the pregnancy. I even felt a little bit wacko, like I don't want, and then because I got pregnant again with Bryn during the time that pregnancy before it would have come to term, right? So it's literally a different universe. Bryn could not exist in this world if I hadn't aborted that first pregnancy. And even though I was a little kind of bizarrely kind of like, I remember even thinking, I don't want this pregnancy, I want that one, being kind of hormonal and weird at the time. But when Bryn came into the world, I looked into her eyes, I fell in love instantly. And I never, ever in my could have imagined kind of preferring a different trajectory of the future. So, so part of this then is that I'm pro-abortion because I adore my daughter, I cherish my daughter, and I kind of, I realize that all around me are people who maybe don't have that direct experience, but like I have another friend who said, I had 3 abortions, and those abortions allowed me to then bring 2 incredible daughters into the world with a partner of my choosing, with my husband, who I loved, when the time is right. And I have these 2 flourishing girls who wouldn't exist if I'd carried forward one or more of those other pregnancies. So again, that is something that the religious right doesn't talk about. They talk as if there were how we were emptying the world of people instead of simply making choices that mean other people come into existence and that we have been able to stack the odds in terms of their flourishing. So all around us then are the living, breathing children of chosen children born to parents who waited, who ended an unhealthy or mistimed or pregnancy, and then later chose to carry forward a new life. And I think that, again, this is a missing part of the conversation, that the right tries to make these claims to moral superiority, and as if we were being kind of morally squishy and they were being morally clear and had a moral framework, when in fact, what I've articulated today as my own moral framework means that these are strongly moral questions for me. It's not a matter of simply thinking that abortion access is okay. I think it is immoral to deny people access to all of the state-of-the-art, all of the medical services that we can provide to allow them to flourish. And so that again is something that kind of, we need to be careful how we talk about that, in the sense of not implying that someone else should have an abortion based on our judgment, but that we, but that there are ways that we can talk about our own experiences. There are ways that people around us can give each other permission to talk about their lived experiences in ways that convey that this isn't just about us being morally wishy-washy, that because we're not Christians, because we're free thinkers, that somehow we lack a moral core or lack moral grounding. And that, of course, question extends not only to kind of contraception and abortion, but to a whole bunch of other issues as well, where they kind of claim the moral high ground, when in fact it's a different basis for morality. So one of the, kind of now I want to just, I know I've been talking for a while, but if I could, I'd like to take another 5 minutes or so to talk about kind of practical ways in which we can engage around these issues, if that's okay.
Sure.
Okay. So one of the things that's very different, there was a wonderful article today in the Washington Post in which 4 women who had abortions pre-Roe v. Wade shared their stories, 2 written and 2 audio. I recommend it. But the reality is that we have some wonderful options right now that weren't available back then, right? So prior to the Dobbs decision, I think most people in the United States didn't know that abortion pills were a thing, but they are. And what it means is that, and they are safe, and they are as safe as any miscarriage can be. And early miscarriages tend to be very safe for the mother. So basically, it's 2 kinds of pills, mifepristone and misoprostol, that are taken in combination. One that causes the uterus to release the embryonic sac, and then the other one that causes cramps that cause the uterus to expel the sac. It looks just like a spontaneous miscarriage, so that if somebody were to take these pills and go to a doctor afterwards because they had an incomplete miscarriage, which can happen again with a spontaneous miscarriage or with an induced miscarriage, that the doctor can't tell the difference. So women don't even have to say, I took abortion pills. They just can say, I'm bleeding, I think I'm experiencing a miscarriage, right? And then they can get the care that they might need to complete an incomplete miscarriage, which is typically a D&C. But these abortion pills also have made abortions much less expensive. So right now, abortion pills can be ordered through they can be received from doctors in states where it's legal, but they can also be ordered online from an organization called Aid Access. And then there's some other distribution networks. Basically, Aid Access is a Dutch organization that kind of formed up because they are providing medication abortions for women in red states where women can't get access to the medication themselves. And basically, the cost is about $150. In the 1960s, the cheapest cost I ever read about for an abortion was $250 in 1960s dollars. So what we're seeing is that the financial barriers have been reduced dramatically relative to kind of what might be required for an office-based procedure. And the religious right has tried to drive up the cost of medication abortions by creating rules that, for example, require that the medications be given in a surgical operating theater, and that they can only be given in a clinic where 2 gurneys can pass each other in the hall. So they tried to create all these regulatory changes that basically made it impossible for women to or really hard for women to get access to these abortions. They tried to make it hard for providers to be able to provide the abortions by requiring anybody who provided abortion pills had to be on a national registry and was at risk of their name being exposed to religious fanatics. So all of that has changed. There are ways that you can spread the word about abortion pills. There is also, there are sites like Plan C that you can support. And I want to be clear, kind of a lot of people confuse Plan B, the morning after pill, with Plan C, which is abortion pills. So we have kind of preventive pills, right? Birth control pills. We have Plan B, which basically you take after sex post-coital contraceptives that can prevent an egg from getting fertilized or prevent a fertilized egg from implanting. And then what you have, but those don't work long term. And then what you have is Plan C, which can actually, as I said, induce a miscarriage that is kind of functionally, biologically the same as a spontaneous miscarriage. So you can get the word out about those pills, about the Plan C. PlanCpills.com is a website where you can get information about all of the different resources. If you have young women in your lives, you might, or young men too, you might want to make sure that they know about this. You can, if young women can pre-buy a course of abortion pills from Aid Access so that they have them on hand for themselves or for their friends. They just go and fill out some information, and then the medical providers in Holland will send those pills, have those pills shipped to them. You can also, sort of join or fund kind of what people are thinking of as the Underground Railroad. If you pay attention, there are abortion access funds that are being created that help women who need to leave their home state to travel, to kind of have a place, have travel expenses or housing expenses in another state, or childcare expenses related, because a lot of the people who have an abortion choose to have an abortion because they already have children and they want to be able to devote their time and energy and resources to ensuring that the children that they already have flourish and they know what their own limits are. But I think that the most leveraged thing that we can do, I mean, certainly kind of the recent political landscape, the 5 direct to the people initiatives that kind of supported abortion rights across the country have sent a strong message that there is a political path to people saying, leave us alone. These decisions are too important for them to be made by politicians and priests. But that the most important thing I think we can do from a leverage standpoint, and where I honestly put most of my energy and money in this fight, is ensuring that people don't get pregnant when they don't want to, right? So there is an organization, a very smart organization called Upstream USA, that simply focuses on going into healthcare systems, upgrading care to meet the kind of state-of-the-art standard of care so that women get kind of have access to the full range of contraceptives, same day, no waiting period, no cost barriers, and that women who go in to clinics across, for whatever reason, reproductive age women get asked what is called one key question as a screening question, which is, would you like to get pregnant in the next year? So in the past, doctors waited for women to come in and say, I want birth control. And then they'd say, well, what do you want? And the girl would say, well, what does my aunt have? What does my friend have? And there's a whole way that conversation is being changed to reflect both a proactive stance. Ask people, even if they come in for a urinary tract infection or a broken leg or whatever it is, would you like to get pregnant in the next year? And then if they say yes, you can kind of start that course of preconception care that I talked about. If they say and if they say no, then you can kind of talk about contraceptive options and technologies, leading with what's most likely to get them to the goals that they want. And if they're unsure, then you do both. Right. So there, that itself is just, that one key question is a radical change in kind of how medical care is practiced. Super simple, but radically kind of effective. And then, as I said, Upstream USA is also changing the clinical practice to ensure that they can streamline, have things available the same day when people want them, that all of the providers know how to provide not just less effective or modern or somewhat effective contraceptives like the pill, but that they know how to provide both, also the state-of-the-art implants and IUDs for people who want them, and how to do that in a way that isn't manipulative, that isn't coercive, that respects personal autonomy, and so that actually does address the very real concerns that people have had about the past history of uninformed care, kind of uninformed medical procedures, and or people not having full information to make the choices that fit their values and their preferences. So let me stop there. Thank you for your patience. Thank you for listening for so long. I'm happy to kind of stick around for questions as long as you'd like.
Okay, let me first say, and I'm almost certain I speak on behalf of everybody here. Wow, that was really, really good, and we are grateful. I was pro-abortion before I heard this, but now I am not only pro-abortion, but a much better informed, wiser person for pro-abortion. I've got a bunch of questions, not because you didn't tell us everything I could imagine you could tell us, but because I can think of some other aspects of this complex subject. I'm sure other people do too. I've got questions about, the exact dividing line on when the man should be involved, if ever, and whether it's tactically helpful to try to educate people about what the Bible really says, and about Freakonomics and the social impact, and about Planned Parenthood and politics. But I want to make sure everybody who wants to ask questions gets a chance to do so. So I'll ask any of mine if nobody else speaks up, but if somebody else wants to weigh in, don't forget to unmute yourself if you want to ask a question. Maybe raise your hand if there are 3 or 4 people, so I can choose one, or Valerie Tarico can choose one. Anybody else got a question you want to ask? I'll be glad if nobody else does, because then I get to ask mine.
I see Dwight nodding his head.
He's muted. Dwight, you got to unmute or you can't.
Actually, I think Renee had her hand up. I don't have a question. I was just
Okay.
in total agreement with everything you said. I'm just excited about what you said, in fact.
Yep.
And
Okay.
I do have one question. The name of that organization that you mentioned at the very end,
Upstream USA.
Upstream USA. I want to find out more about them. So great. But I think Renee had a question.
Renee?
I wonder, am I muted? No, I'm okay.
You're unmuted.
I'm muted?
You're
No,
unmuted.
you're
I can
good.
hear you. You're okay.
Well,
But now you're muted.
In the bottom left part of your screen is a microphone. If it's not marked through, you're good. At the moment, yours is muted. So go to the bottom left, click on it. There you go.
Now you're good.
I can't help but wonder how many of the politicians who don't believe in abortion in case of rape and incest, life of the mother, would like to see their 12-year-old daughter walking around middle school with a big belly because she got raped. They would not. They would take that little girl off for an abortion so fast, it wouldn't be funny. And that would be the truth, because you can't imagine anybody wanting to see their child who was raped walking around school with a big belly. And secondly, I wonder, it was just mentioned briefly, why we hear so little about the part of the man. It's like it's all the woman who got herself, the women who get themselves pregnant all by themselves. We don't hear enough about the role of the man in getting a woman pregnant and how he should be involved from the very second it happened. It took 2 people. And it sounds like all the time it was just one. And I've been involved in this since 72 when I was walking around all over with a petition for Roe versus Wade to get passed. I even found a Roe button in my drawer the other day. What is that, 50 years ago? And I have 3 daughters, and it's been so important to me that we've gone so far backward. Thank you.
Thank you. My generation, certainly, and kind of people who have come since, all benefited from your advocacy and from the advocacy of your peers. Thank you. I agree that we don't talk enough about male responsibility. I also think, though, that sometimes when we do talk about male responsibility, we talk about it in a way that is kind of punitive. And even when we talk about male responsibility, we're often not talking about men as partners and people, right, in their own right, who are profoundly affected by this question of this is about family formation. It's one of the kind of things that is most sacred to human beings in every culture around the planet, right? And yes, men are profoundly a part of that, both in terms of the responsibility of managing their fertility, although it's hard to ask them to be more responsible. Again, it will be much easier to ask them to be fully responsible when they have better means to do so. That's just the truth. And it's irritating to me that someone like Elon Musk could have just like funded male contraception for the entirety of the human race, right? Rather than buying Twitter, but that's a sidetrack.
Well, to follow up a little bit on Renee, the question I was going to ask about male responsibility, I don't think there's any question, and I don't think most pro-abortion, pro-choice people think there's any question, that the default should always be the woman. She's the one most affected. No question about that. But is it possible to talk about the fact that a man should have something to say about this under some circumstances? I'm sure it's complicated. Rapists shouldn't have anything to say about it. A husband of the last 10 years who's been wanting a child for the last 10 years should certainly have more to say about it. Can you comment on the politics and the difficulty of not making the default 100% while still making it clear that the default should be 100%.
Yeah, I think that, you know, I would go, so it's obvious to me that most or many abortion decisions are made in partnership, right? With kind of two people kind of who care about each other. People are often sometimes people are just having sex because it's fun and it's pleasurable. Sometimes people are sexually assaulted. Sometimes people are manipulated or coerced or abused, but that's not most sex, right? Most sex is between two people who enjoy each other, who care about each other to a small degree or to a great degree. And in those circumstances, it's just stupid that we act like men shouldn't have preferences about this, right? It's such an important part of what it means to be a human being, to kind of think about parenthood. And so, like you saw kind of the language that I used repeatedly, I talked simultaneously about men being kind of partners and having a stake and being able to kind of make these decisions together and being mutually supportive and being vulnerable. And I also kind of reiterated the kind of statement that needs to default to the person most affected, to the woman, right? And I think that in order to be able to carry forward that kind of conversation, you have to kind of pair those two things together, because if you just talk about men being able to have preferences and of course having feelings, and we want men to have feelings, like what the heck, we diss men when they don't know how to articulate or express or experience their feelings, and we call that toxic masculinity. And then we tell them they shouldn't have any feelings about one of the most important things that has happened in their lives or might happen in their lives, right? That doesn't make a lot of sense to me. But I do think that you have to kind of talk about those things, pairing them together. Just like Ed, I think if you kind of in public say I'm pro-abortion, you also have to say I'm also pro-choice, right? So that you're not perceived or misperceived as a champion of reproductive coercion who would kind of impose abortion on other people like the Chinese government sometimes did, right?
Yeah.
Well, go ahead.
The thing I would add to that, I'm sure that in many, many cases, one of the things that's important to the woman's decision is knowing what the man actually thinks about this. Does that guy want to have a child? Is he willing to be a full-fledged parent for however many years it'll be, we hope? Or is he more casual? That could very well affect her opinion, even though she's the one that has the default and should be the one who has the default.
Absolutely.
Valerie, I like your approach of the family planning. No one taught me, said anything about planning a family when I was growing up, whereas an adult, and the impact of raising a family for 20 plus years and longer. Nowadays it's 30 or 40 years, and grandchildren, and et cetera. So it's a big impact that we as a society don't or haven't talked about. And the churches don't talk about it. The schools don't talk about it. They talk about sex, but they don't talk about family. So I think we could make a lot of ground using your approach and getting the far left and the far right together on talking about families.
Yeah. You know, I have some friends who live in Vancouver, British Columbia, and one of the things that they had in their high school there was they had a life planning course. It was part of their health class, and family planning was just perceived as part of life planning, right? So with whether it was young women or young men, kind of being able to ask them, kind of, do you want to be a dad someday? What are your dreams? What would you like to kind of accomplish before then? I think those are kinds of conversations that can be had not only with girls and or in women's clinics, but they are also conversations that medical providers and teachers and other folks can begin to have with young men as well. So that, because until you ask the question, like I remember being with a group of my daughter's college friends, and I asked them, and like, no, literally, this is a group of guys who were like sophomores in college. No one had asked them those questions. And until you ask until somebody does ask, you might not even feel like you have permission to ask yourself, or you might not think to ask yourself those questions. I think there could be a whole shift in terms of how we talk with boys and young men about this.
I got another question. Anybody else? I'm so
Betsy has her hand up.
okay, Betsy.
Yes, I'm sorry I came in late. I don't know if this was discussed earlier, but I'm concerned about something called the global gag rule, which evidently was reinstated under Donald Trump. It was started by Ronald Reagan, but as it stands, the rule, this is from a website, the rule targets international organizations that work on any programs funded by U.S. global health assistance, including programs to expand access to contraception, prevent and treat HIV/AIDS, combat malaria, and improve maternal and child health. They're not able to discuss any of this. And there are organizations that are for global health assistance, but they cannot touch any of this. If they accept U.S. money, let's put it that way.
Yeah, that's been a big, it has been a problem around the world. And Betsy, I should know what the status right now is of the global gag rule, and I have to say that I don't. This kind of manipulation of aid to other countries has been a huge impact, partly because it just creates chaos, and then aid organizations or organizations on the ground in other countries will back off of talking about contraception and abortion just because they're unsure what the rules might be, or if the rules might change, or the rules do kind of, so for example, the PEPFAR funding that George Bush underwrote to kind of provide help to Africa around AIDS when the AIDS epidemic was surging, specifically excluded funding and conversation about contraception, not just abortion, but contraception, which is, again, super harmful, right? Because one of the top ways that you can prevent mother-to-child transmission of HIV is by ensuring that people don't get pregnant when they don't want to, right? So we had kind of people doing these elaborate research programs to kind of figure out, is it better to breastfeed babies? Is it better to bottle feed babies when the mother's HIV positive? All kinds of complicated things to try to reduce mother-to-child transmission, but no contraception.
Is it tactically wise to try to educate a pro-lifer about the fact that, for example, the Bible doesn't say anything about abortion, or that it's not murdering a baby? I'm asking you as a psychologist. I know your opinion is the same as mine about wanting to change their mind, but what helps to change minds like that?
Not much. So it's kind of like, does it help to talk to your evangelical relatives about their religious beliefs? Probably not. There's kind of a polished wall around some of those beliefs. And they are overdetermined in large part by kind of information flow and their predominant community. I think one of the things that was powerful and effective in the fight for gay rights and ultimately gay marriage was people coming out of the closet and folks realizing that someone they love was gay, right? And so I think the same thing is true with abortion, that we can kind of speak from our own experience. We can tell our own stories and kind of complicate the conversation in that way. But for the most part, we're not going to change the minds of people who have been immersed in that indoctrination. You can kind of let people know that you disagree and then see if that invites a conversation. But yeah, I think we're better off knowing that the vast majority of Americans do support abortion access under at least some circumstances, and then working to ensure that that medical care is available under all of the circumstances that kind of people do support. Steve, you had your hand up.
Yeah, well, I just wanted to thank you for talking about birth control and the importance of educating people about birth control. And there were a couple of thoughts on this. One of them is that lot of times I think religion is the problem. For example, I was reading a book a few days ago. It was written by a Roman Catholic priest, and it had the imprimatur of the Roman Catholic Church on the back page, which means that they looked it over, and the church generally agrees with what he says. And he was saying that you should never, never educate children about reproduction, because they might experiment and then they would sin or something, right? And so what they say is don't teach children about reproduction at all, which also means you don't teach them about birth control or anything else. What happens, unfortunately, is that they often learn about reproduction from their friends, their peers. And then if they experiment, the girl can get pregnant because they don't know about birth control or anything, or the consequences of the act. And then people get in trouble. And so I think the answer is to educate your children about reproduction, but also educate them about the consequences of the sex act, what can happen. The girl can get pregnant, so you need to be careful. And using birth control can help to reduce the chance of pregnancy a great deal. So education, I think, is the answer in that regard. And a lot of times churches or religion in general is against education. The other thing is that the Roman Catholic Church is against birth control in general, even for married couples. They say, oh, somehow this is wrong. And that's more of a problem just caused by religion, I think. The result is that the couple cannot do any family planning, really.
That comes out of a tradition that I call Christian competitive breeding, that there is, if you think of religions as self-replicators, kind of viral self-replicators, and then there has been this natural selection process on religions that those that kind of reproduce by evangelism or by competitive breeding tend to kind of grow, right? And so the Catholic Church would never say this explicitly, or maybe they would at least have it sometimes in history admitted that this is all about kind of growing their fan base by forcing children to kind of be baby ranchers, essentially. So it comes from the competitive breeding aspect of religion. It also kind of course, because the Abrahamic religions are anchored to the Iron Age by text worship, essentially, pleolatry, then what you have is kind of them being anchored to this Iron Age view of women and reproduction. And the Iron Age view of women and reproduction was that women and children were literally chattel. They were economic assets that belonged to men. And so they were like, the word cattle and the word chattel are related, right? They basically, if you think about it in those terms, then it's like a woman's primary function is to produce kind of these small economic assets, the offspring, and you would never kind of, a cow, I actually own cattle. A cow, cattle belong to us. If they get pregnant, they don't get to decide whether they want to get pregnant once a year. And when their offspring are born, their offspring also belong to us. And we get to decide what to do with them. And that's the whole biblical view of women, right? To the point that men can not just send their children off to war or force them to work in the fields, but also can kind of human sacrifice them, right? That's the kind of central story of the Jesus thing. And so those pieces that are, there's these two very powerful currents. One is the self-promotional aspect that has been caused by natural selection on religion. And then the other thing that goes way back into history of men owning and controlling female reproductive capacity, probably if men had the same reproductive capacity, they probably wouldn't care so much about the reproductive capacity of women. But it's been a long, arduous process trying to unwind that. Mark, at one point, I think you were trying to say something.
Mark?
Unmute, Mark. I muted you earlier because we were getting feedback from your system. Sorry. There you go.
Can you hear me now?
Oh, yeah.
Okay. All right, I want to talk about the miserable state of sex education, especially in this country. When I was growing up, in about the fifth grade, here in 1961 or two, we had a sex education class, which involved a brief little film, basically with nothing but stick figures, and the teachers used all the proper medical terminology. And for fifth grade kids, we didn't know what the words meant or anything, and that was the extent of it. Now, I learned all I needed to know long before that. I had a cousin, Bobby, who was 10 years older than me, and he was in the Navy. When he came home on leave, he would bring these 16 millimeter black and white films that he got in Europe, all about various sex acts, which were and he would tell us all about these wonderful adventures in these brothels in Europe and in his Navy adventures. But a number of years ago, Bob Guccione, the guy who published Penthouse magazine, came up with a sex education video. It was on a VHS, about an hour and a half total, and it included going through and naming all of the proper names for the male and female anatomy, but all the slang terms used with it as well. And there were quite a few. A lot of them I'd heard, a lot of them I hadn't. But in very detailed close-up graphic, color video, it showed all the different things that you could do, how you could insert the penis into the vagina and various other orifices of the body, and a very detailed graphic display of various venereal diseases, which were kind of gory in some cases. All kinds of crap like this, and the even included a part on the proper use of a condom. Showed a guy with an erection, and this is how you put the condom on, and this is how you make sure it doesn't leak, and all this kind of stuff. Now, my son, who is now 36 years old, got to see this film when I got it for him when he was about 12 years old, and answered most all his questions, and several times he'd invite his friends over in the afternoon, and they would watch it with him again and again and again. And this, I don't know whatever happened to that video cassette. It's long gone. But anyway, but the pathetic state of sex education in this country, the public schools are not going to do it because it's too much of a political lightning rod. But parents have to teach their boys, like she was talking about earlier, the male side of birth control. Men need to learn, what's going on, and how to prevent not only pregnancies but transmission of various diseases and all kinds of things like that. And I don't foresee anything in that area changing anytime soon. Did anybody comments about that?
So, what Steve said when Steve talked about the religious rights, saying that if you teach children about reproduction, then they're gonna experiment. There is absolutely no research that suggests that shows that kind of sex ed increases the sexual or experimentation or makes it earlier. In fact, the opposite is true. And I think that what we know, it makes sense if you think about it, because mostly children in our society are exposed to sexuality in contexts in which the conversation is titillating, right? So it's Hollywood movies for the most part, right? And then maybe they can find online porn or whatever. But basically, so they're in this arousal pattern that they're kind of associating sex with arousal, and it's an irrational emotional state of mind. And when you have sex ed, what you're doing is you're engaging the rational part of your brain. You're linking sex and thoughts about sex to kind of your smarter self, your kind of, your rational self, and kind of the part of you that's able to kind of process information and to think, have a future orientation, so that what we don't want is for people to just have this disconnect, so that when they're thinking about sex, they go into irrational mode. And when they, kind of what we want is to kind of be able to have kind of a set of associations to the ideas about sex and information about sex and images of sexuality that kind of are across the spectrum, that engage the whole person.
Mm-hmm. It's about time for us to do a formal wrap up. I'm not trying to get anybody to depart, but we need to have a point where everyone, including the speaker, can say, okay, well, this is what I signed up for, and now I got other things I got to do. So I would like to formally end the Q&A, but not to cut off discussion amongst everyone, including the speaker, who may want to continue to have conversation. And I think, Steve, that you usually are willing to keep the Zoom thing open and going for.
Sure. I'm always the last one out. That's okay.
I have a question.
Steve's the captain of the ship.
There you go.
I have a question.
Okay.
Go ahead.
I was listening to podcasts just before the Dobbs decision, trying to get some of this straight in my own head, to some New York Times podcasts. And one of them was a discussion between Michelle Goldberg and Ross Douthat, who was very conservative. And I just wanted to read you this little snippet. It was at the very end of the podcast. It was the last thing anyone said in it. So no one had a chance to respond, but I'd like to get your reaction to this. What would your talking points be in response to sort of what Ross Douthat is saying here? And I'll just read it to you. He says, there is, I think, a failure of imagination that goes to the pro-choice side struggle to win over people in the middle. It's like, oh, the pro-life side, wait, they actually believe in the humanity of the fetus? No, surely they just want to control women. And he goes on to say, well, you have to be able to make that imaginative leap on an issue where so many people are in the middle if you're going to win over those people. You have to be able to see why it would make a difference to a lot of Americans that if these laws are passed in these states, hundreds of thousands of people will be alive. There are already thousands of people alive right now in Texas who would have been aborted. And that's the heart of the pro-life argument. And you have to address that argument if you're going to win over other people to your side of the case. So how would you respond to that? What would your talking points be?
Yeah. Well, so I think, first of all, that he's factually wrong in that there's now research that shows that most of the reduction in abortion in red states post Dobbs was offset by increases in mail order abortions. So even excluding the ones that were kind of pre-orders that kind of were women who just said, I just want to have this on hand, that they now think that until probably about the time of the election, there was in aggregate across all of the red states that imposed trigger laws that kind of reduced abortion access, that there were probably around 2,000 pregnancies that were carried forward that wouldn't have been otherwise. So when he says thousands of people in Texas, I think he's factually wrong about that. But I think that I think he's like there's a bunch of different parts to that, right? I think he's right that when we say it's all about controlling women, and that the right wingers who say that they believe a fetus is a living soul, that they're liars. I mean, we are wrong on that, right? There's a bunch of true believers in there who have become convinced that that is the case. And then they've taken on a moral framework that lets them think that this is a person. And so you do have to, maybe we do need to address that question of fetal personhood explicitly. And you saw that what I did in my article of why I'm pro-abortion, and we're in the talk today, is I did that by saying, I think that personhood is about the lived experience of sentient beings, that personhood in my mind exists on a continuum of like what you are capable of experiencing and caring about, and kind of starting with kind of the basics, pleasure and pain, and kind of all the way up to being able to kind of live in community with other fully kind of sentient human beings, and to kind of value your own existence and to love and be loved, etc. Right? And that fact aspect of personhood. So he's using the term people really loosely, right? He's calling all of those kind of however many actual fetuses there are currently in Texas that there wouldn't be, say 500, say 750, say 1,000, whatever. He's calling those people when most of them, in my definition, aren't people yet, right? They have the potential to become people. So yeah, there are conversations here that we could be having more explicitly. I don't know how I would answer him succinctly in an interview, but there's several different aspects of that, right? I do think that there's a bunch of folks who have become devoted to this idea that the fetus is a living soul from the moment of conception, and that, first of all, we're not going to persuade them. There's nothing we can do to persuade them. We shouldn't be trying. We need to be having other conversations with other people.
Mhm.
Was there another aspect of it? I might have missed something.
Oh, I think that's great.
I'd like to speak to that. The question basically of persuading people to change their view on abortion by confronting them with the great contradiction that exists between a very strongly held, maybe the most strongly held, at least nominally strongly held value that they have. I mean, right wingers, if you ask them, what's for you, what's the most important value? Freedom. It's freedom, you know? And then but if you point out that basically when you have the state and force childbearing, it's a kind of slavery. The woman is put in a state of very, very intense, initially, slavery to an unwanted kind of a parasitic appurtenance to maybe a form of slavery that lessens. But what these people who believe that freedom is the be all and end all of values, you know, the summum bonum, they are basically strongly are speaking strongly in favor of a kind of slavery, the very opposite of freedom.
Mm-hmm.
So that's a contradiction that they have to be able to absorb.
And that language around reproductive freedom does seem to resonate with a lot of people in the middle, and a lot of people who are ambivalent about abortion, or who would kind of say, I'd prefer that abortion was obsolete, right? So the freedom question, you know, it's an important one. And I think that we can use that language. There may be some of, rare circumstances when you can say to someone, yeah, it's not, the Bible is actually never speaks against abortion. In fact, it's got some pro-abortion circumstances and passages. You could say that kind of thing, may or may not be persuasive, but it seems like what you just brought up, the kind of question of people being able to form their own families, be free from reproductive coercion. What's happened in China, is like they went from one kind of reproductive coercion, forcing people to have IUDs or even tubal ligations, and to not have more than one child. And now they've swung back to the more traditional kind of reproductive coercion, which you called slavery, right? Where they're like shutting down clinics, not letting people get vasectomies, not letting people get tubal ligations, kind of trying to kind of coerce or manipulate people into having more babies for the sake of the state, right? So kind of it is like treating people like baby factories. And that has been historically the greatest kind of reproductive coercion, whether people were trying to kind of produce cannon fodder or workers for the fields or literal slaves by kind of slave owners raping their slaves, right? I mean, there's that has been the kind of reproductive coercion that has gone back for millennia.
Yeah, that's great. That's good.
All right. Any more questions? Right. I don't know if Ed fully thanked Valerie for her talk, but I'd like to thank her for talking to us and give her some applause.